Antony Beevor, you've been writing famous books about Stalingrad, about the fall of Berlin, about the Spanish Civil War, and now you're writing a book about D-Day. Why?
The whole point of writing about D-Day, after particularly Berlin and Stalingrad, was to make not so much a trilogy but a triangle, because I'd really covered the Eastern Front, and I'd always been fascinated by comparing the intensity of the fighting on the Eastern Front with D-Day itself. And the whole development of D-Day was also a very key element in relations between the Western Allies and Stalin himself.
From many people's point of view who visits Normandy during D-Day, they feel that that's perhaps the most important battle of the Second World War too. Would you agree to that, or do you have another opinion?
Well, there have been several key turning points in the Second World War. I mean, the really major one was in fact December 1941. In fact, one could even go back to say, if Churchill had not decided to fight on in May 1940, then Hitler would have won the war. Then there was December 1941, Hitler's failure to capture Moscow, and of course the American entry into the war, and that made the defeat of Germany inevitable. Stalingrad was a great psychological turning point. The importance of D-Day, on the other hand, was that it decided the history of Western Europe after the war. If the invasion had failed, then we would have seen a very, very different map to Europe, and perhaps a very different development in all of the events since 1945. So from that point of view, it's an important one.
Then how big was the risk that the invasion would have failed?
I think that the risk mainly came from the threat from the weather. And this is why I start in the book, I start with Eisenhower's decision. I mean, it was probably the most important single decision of the Second World War, and one of the most difficult ones to take. And one has to admire him for the way that actually he sort of retained his sanity with this huge responsibility on his shoulders. The weather, if they had sailed 2 weeks later, if they had not seen that particular gap in the weather coming in on the 6th of June, and they'd sailed 2 weeks later, which was the only alternative combination of tides and light which would have made it possible, they would have arrived in the biggest storm which the Channel has ever seen for over 40 years. So there was a tremendous element of risk there. Then, of course, you can discuss the whole question of could the Germans have actually defeated the invasion. All one can say really is that the Allies were incredibly lucky, because Operation Fortitude, this brilliant deception plan, had convinced them that the main attack was actually going to be coming in the Pas-de-Calais and not in Normandy. And as a result, they did not have quite sufficient forces in Normandy to repulse the invasion. So all of these elements together showed that it was really quite close. And if the German Navy, for example, had put to sea that night, and they decided, because the weather was so bad, they decided not to, then again the Allied invasion craft could have suffered a very severe fate. But once again, it's one of the what-ifs of history.
You've written one of your most famous books is your book about Stalingrad. How would you compare the fighting during the D-Day with the Eastern Front?
The fighting on D-Day itself was actually less desperate than I think the Allied commanders had expected. They were expecting something like 10,000 casualties or so. In the event, it wasn't nearly as bad as that, but the fighting afterwards was actually far worse than they had expected. And the fighting afterwards in the Bocage and on the left, the British fighting the German SS Panzer divisions, was actually more intense than on the Eastern Front. In fact, it was a Swedish historian, Niklas Zettling, who first pointed to the way that the German casualties during Normandy were considerably higher than the average on the Eastern Front. And I think this gives a pretty good idea of the savagery of the fighting, and also the killing of prisoners on both sides, which has been a subject, not surprisingly, which has tended to be overlooked in previous accounts of the battle. the American paratroopers had been really hyped up. Their blood was up when they dropped onto the Cotentin Peninsula. And there was, if you like, some of the most savage fighting that one's ever seen on the Western Front at that particular point. And on the British and Canadian front, fighting the SS Hitlerjugend, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the German side, particularly the Waffen-SS, started the killing of prisoners, particularly against the Canadians, and the Canadians responded with gusto, and the killings really became really quite serious. I mean, the exact figures are, of course, impossible to know, but we certainly have very strong indications of its level.
Let's talk a bit about your sources. Could you mention some of your most important sources for us?
Well, the sources are all, as obviously the most vital thing of all, particularly it's the accumulation of detail that one's looking for. And since the last books on the subject were written, I mean, basically, the thing which surprised me the most was that there's been no major book on D-Day and the Battle of Normandy really since the 1980s, since sort of Max Hastings, Carlo d'Este, John Keegan. So that's over 25 years. And in the meantime, what's happened is many people from German families, American, British, Canadian, and of course, above all, French, have left diaries and collections of letters to museums and archives. And this has been a very important source of the sort of contemporary detail that you really need. I don't believe now in, you can't interview veterans this long after the event, because in many cases, having taken part in an important battle, they have filtered their own experiences and memories through the official histories or the various books that they've read on the subject. And I don't think it's sort of really fair on either on the reader or even on them. I think one's got to go for contemporary sources as far as possible. And that is why diaries are so vital. Letters home sometimes tend to be softened, if you like, so as not to give the full horror of the fighting to families. Diaries are vital, but the other thing was that one of the most important sources for me, particularly on the American side, were the combat historians. The Americans, with tremendous resources, were able to send in young academics, young academic historians, to interview soldiers and officers as they came out of the battle or very soon after the battle. And this provides absolutely essential contemporary evidence, which I think is important not just from the point of view of the record, but to understand how they were feeling at the time. And this is the only way, I think, to recreate history which a younger generation today who's not lived through any idea of totalitarian warfare can start to understand the full horrors of it.
During this summer, thousands and thousands of visitors are going to go to Normandy. What would you recommend them to see when they are there?
Well, there are many things indeed to see in Normandy. I think, of course, one of the most important, one of the most moving, is where one of the most important visitors, which is President Obama, will be going on the 6th of June, which, of course, will be Omaha Beach and the American cemetery just above it, which is one of the most extraordinary cemeteries I've ever seen in the world. But you really do need to walk on Omaha Beach to see what they were facing when they landed, and realize, and by reading accounts of the time, and understand really what they had to go through to get up those bluffs and to secure that particular beach.
Thank you, Antony Beevor.
Thank you, Ray.